Awesome. Can everyone hear me? Okay. You can open your camera for a minute if you want or whatever you want, but maybe just like give me a thumbs up or send in the chat if you can hear me and see me. All right. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. And that's great. If you want to keep yourself muted, that's perfect because it's going to be a lecture style. And then at the end, I'll open it up for questions. So I wanted to start by explaining the origin of my interest in the matrilineal line, which is ultimately the core of what sets me apart from other fertility awareness teachers. I'm the only teacher out there who has really been linking the matrilineal line to the menstrual cycle throughout the entire menstrual cycle. We can thread in the matrilineal line into the
Okay.
menstrual cycle. Hang on one second. It's gonna do one thing.
Let me look at it real quick.
Okay, this is good. Okay, sorry everyone. All right. So what's the origin of my interest in the matrilineal line? I'm gonna just mute Alicia. Hang on. So glad you're here, Alicia. One sec. Here we
Oh,
go. Right. So what is the origin of my interest in the matrilineal line? It really began when I was a little girl. My mother gave birth to me and my brothers naturally, and she was just really a woman who was in tune with herself and in tune with her cycles and in tune with biology because she was a nurse herself, and she was actually an obstetric nurse, so she was witnessing births in that capacity for a long time of her life before I was born. And so when I was born, I was her first daughter, and she was really excited to have a daughter and to pass on the blood mysteries to me. And so she would always speak about how, as a little girl, I had all of the eggs within my body that I would ever have in my life. And I know that this is a contentious statement for me to say that women are born with all of their eggs because there have been two research studies recently published that challenge this very widely accepted fact. Uh, I will address that on the other side of those two studies that challenge this fact, which I'm going to be directly addressing this question in the next masterclass Beyond FAM. But I will say that there is a large and very well established body of research that does support the claim that women are born with all of their eggs, that baby girls are born with all of their eggs, because medical practitioners have done dissections on bodies and they have seen that all of the eggs are contained within the ovaries. So, with these studies coming in to challenge this fact, we can't forget that there's already an established body of research supporting this idea. And I'm going to share my slides here actually. And here we go. So, can you all guys all see that? You women all see that? Misnomer. Not no guys here. Um, awesome. So you've probably all seen this picture before. And this picture is depicting the fact that when I was a fetus carried inside of my mother. So here, this picture actually helps. So there's my mom. So when my mom in the middle was pregnant with me, the eggs that eventually became my daughter, the egg, sorry, that eventually became my daughter Nula was already contained within my body, within my ovaries. And additionally to that, the egg that became my son, I was also carrying the egg that became my son when I was a fetus inside my mother when she was pregnant with me. And so that is why we say that there's a link between the grandchildren and the grandmother, because my children, Nula and Griffin, this woman in the middle, this is their grandmother. And she is the origin of where they came from. Their first um, entrance into the world was when they were formed inside me, when I had my ovaries forming, when I was a 5-month-old fetus inside my mother. Her name's Yvonne. And um, and that's the same for boys and girls. And so that's the link between the mother and the grandchildren. And that's the same for me and my grandmother, right? Her name was Greta, short for Margaret. And so when Yvonne was a fetus inside Greta's womb in around 1950, the egg that became me was already contained within my mother's ovaries. And so obviously it's only half of the person, right? Like the egg is only half of the genetic material that creates the baby eventually. But still, there is this our primal origins are held within the wombs of our grandmothers before we're even born. So we have this whole life as eggs before our conception even happens. And so when I started to bring this into the menstrual cycle, a huge turning point for me was actually when I became pregnant with my daughter, because I had always heard this fact. I had seen this image thrown around, but when I got pregnant with my daughter Nula, I didn't know if she was a boy or a girl. So this was only a realization that hit me in hindsight. But after she was born, I realized that this fact I had been, throwing around and even citing myself in my fertility awareness teachings, that I had lived this fact. That when we say that the future generation is held by our grandmothers, the moment of me, the opportunity for me to hold my grandchildren when they were eggs inside my daughter Nula had passed. Those 5 months of my life, it's a brief period when the grandmother gets to hold the eggs of her potential future grandchildren. And so going through that experience really made this fact much more embodied and imprinted within my body. And then I really started to unite these two ideas, this fact about the matrilineal line and the menstrual cycle. And so many women feel the resonance of this fact when we're giving birth. We feel a connection to the women in our line before us who have given birth. And this biological fact is really the physiological basis for that spiritual experience that so many women share. So when I started to weave the matrilineal line in with the menstrual cycle, okay, yeah, just double checking we're recording. Okay, so when I started to weave in the matrilineal line with the menstrual cycle, the big light bulb moment for me was the death of the egg. So I'm going to stop sharing actually. I just want to kind of go back and forth between the slides. So yeah, this is good. So when my husband and I were practicing fertility awareness, we started to use this language with each other. The egg died because, and I'm going to kind of wheel it back and we'll go slower through the menstrual cycle. But through this introduction, I'm just kind of going to take it for granted that you kind of have your bearings within the menstrual cycle, and then I'll wheel it back. So the luteal phase is the time of our cycle when we can have unprotected sex and not worry about getting pregnant. And so what is the bridge between ovulation and the luteal phase? It's the death of the egg. And so if you're using fertility awareness and you're really looking forward to the end of your fertile window when you've entered the luteal phase, it's really empowering to be able to identify the moment in time. And you can only identify this through your intuition, through your introspection and inner knowing. It's really empowering to be able to identify the moment when your egg dies. And sorry, I just want to say, any of you women, if you have questions while I'm talking, just throw them in the chat and then I'll read some of them out at the end. And if you have reactions or insights, just throw them in the chat. It would be so nice to see them there. So if you can identify the moment that your egg dies, then you can have a lot more power using fertility awareness method to avoid pregnancy, because as soon as your egg has died, you have moved from your fertile window into the luteal phase. And the luteal phase is Other than our periods, the luteal phase is probably, among all women who don't even know much about the menstrual cycle, that's one of the phases that's the most easy to recognize just from intuitive signs because of this taboo idea of PMS, which I don't think it's taboo. I think it's wonderful that all women can hear the words PMS and immediately recognize what we're talking about. And the reason I like those terms is because it's so empowering for women. Even to just take that piece out of the fertility awareness method is such a huge, could be such a huge gift to women, just to know that when you're feeling PMS, you're likely not fertile. Of course, using the fertility awareness method will give you a higher level of accuracy in knowing whether or not you're fertile. Even though even if you feel like your egg has died, there are signs you can track to like bolster your confidence of that knowing that your egg died. So it was really through bringing in the matrilineal line with the menstrual cycle that I was able to see the death of the egg so clearly as the bridge between ovulation and the luteal phase. And so there are three levels through which the death of the egg is felt. And the first level is that it feels like a state change. So throughout your entire life, even pre-conception, you've had your eggs within your ovaries. And then when that egg is ovulated and after the egg has died, that is the first moment in your life that that unique egg has been outside of your ovary and has died. So just on the level of it's a change, you notice it. And there's an echo of this in postpartum. A lot of women feel blue or lost or overwhelmed in postpartum. And my experience and through my knowing of fertility awareness, what I really felt in postpartum was the same kind of change, whiplash. You're going in one direction, you're pregnant, and then all of a sudden we're turning. The birth happened, and now we're turning into motherhood. So it's like you were going in one direction and then you're changing into another. And that's so similar to what's happening when you ovulate. It's a momentous and yet short, arguably like microscopic and short journey that the egg makes. So eggs inside your ovaries are encased in follicles. And what is so cool is that we come from water. What are the follicles? They're fluid-filled sacs. So every egg is nourished by water throughout your entire life. And then those eggs during the follicular phase begin to bud and develop, and one egg becomes the dominant follicle, which teaser of Beyond Fam, like, is it the dominant follicle? So what I'm really trying to do in this class is set up all of the knowledge that is established and out there and that everyone's familiar with the menstrual cycle, of course, with my own unique spin, but to really set it up so that in Beyond Fam, we can begin to question it. So take it or leave it. The story we're told is that it's the dominant, the strongest, the biggest egg that is the first one to become so large and so strong that it bursts through the follicle. So it bursts through the fluid-filled sac. And then after it bursts through the fluid-filled sac, that momentum allows the egg to emerge through the ovarian wall. So it's the first time that egg has left your ovary in your entire life since before conception. And so in that journey that, of course, like within your body, the measurement of that journey is really small. But to me, that journey is momentous because it's the first time the egg has left the ovary in your entire life. So that's the first level, that it just feels like a change. And then the second level of feeling the death of the egg is that you feel a sense of grief. So instinctually, we have primal instincts within us as women where we crave and desire pregnancy. And actually, the entire menstrual cycle is a rehearsal for pregnancy. So this primal craving that we have for pregnancy, which could be on a spiritual level, is also imprinted on the body in an embodied level, because that's what the menstrual cycle is. Every time the egg dies, your body is acting as if you were pregnant until the signal comes that the egg hasn't been fertilized. And so I started to notice that there was this primal sense of grief and rejection from my husband that I hadn't conceived in that cycle. And even though in my mind I knew I didn't want to conceive, I still had these primal feelings of rage, grief, overwhelm coming up. And it's been really interesting to have some women in my DMs share that they don't resonate with this like kind of like up and down way that I teach the menstrual cycle. And I totally agree. And as I mature in my womanhood and as I move even further out of the regions of having small children, my kids are 6 and 9 now. I I also see that I have less rage and I don't always have the same feelings around the death of the egg. It might just be overwhelmed or feeling flustered or feeling chaotic. And so I think that it's very nuanced and we're going to talk more about that in Beyond Fam. But the reason that I draw so much emphasis to the death of the egg is because I think there's a lot of power in that for women. That if we can stop denying the fact that we're not exactly the same in the luteal phase as we were in the follicular phase, if we can own that and notice it and no, don't let it like destroy your life or don't make it like maybe don't make it so you're yelling at your kids or yes of course we want to like stay above the waves of the luteal phase but I still think it's really valuable to describe how the follicular phase and the luteal phase feel so different from each other. And the third level of how we feel the death of the egg is on a physiological hormonal level. So before the death of the egg, estrogen and follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are all building. And then at the moment of ovulation, that's the hormonal peak. And after ovulation, those three hormones I just mentioned, estrogen, FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, they all suddenly plummet. And then coinciding with that, the casing of the dead egg, which is called the corpus luteum, and actually interestingly stays behind in the ovary. It's only the egg that actually comes out. So this like yellow body, it's cool that we know the color. They tell us we know the color. So it's like this yellow body staying alive inside the ovary that emits the progesterone, which is the characteristic hormone of the luteal phase where we feel warmer and we notice the symptoms of the luteal phase under the dominance of progesterone. And progesterone is the same hormone that is taking our hand through pregnancy. It's the same dominant hormone in pregnancy. So that's also why pregnant women feel warmer after they conceive and they stay at a warmer basal body temperature throughout their pregnancy. So just to recap, the three ways that you feel the death of the egg are that it's a state change from you've been feeling you've had your egg within you your entire life. Suddenly it's ovulated and it's died. So that feels starkly different. The second way is on the level of grief, arising from the primal desire to be pregnant and the primal grief that comes from when you don't conceive. And then the third way we feel the death of the egg is on a physiological hormonal level. All right, so let's go here to this. I'm going to share this and I just want to actually, sorry guys, I'm just going to do this for 1 second. I'm just going to share my hang on. Okay, that's weird. I don't see it. Okay, no problem. I was just gonna share my like whiteboard to draw you something, but I'll just draw it here. It's no problem. Okay, so I just want to kind of really go back to basics. I'm just gonna draw it over this slide. Sorry, I don't have a blank slide. So if we look at the menstrual cycle like this, then I just want to just really outline the 4 parts of the menstrual cycle. So the first part is your period. The second part is your follicular phase. The third part is ovulation, and the fourth part is your luteal phase. So just so we're all on the same page as we dive deeper into this, when I'm talking about day 1 of your cycle, that's the first day that you see bright red blood, when the blood changes from spotting to a heavy downward, or not heavy, but like a noticeable downward flow. That's the beginning of your period. And then moving into the follicular phase as number 2, which is when the follicles, when your eggs are beginning to develop, and then ovulation when the egg emerges, and luteal phase, which is PMS, which is after you have ovulated. So really what I started to see after teaching and speaking and thinking so much about the death of the egg, then I started to see how there's another side of this coin, which is ovulation. I can't believe I missed it all these years. And um and this is such a beautiful piece, and I think that this piece can really be a balm to the soul of any woman who longs for motherhood and who didn't get that chance to be a mother in her life. Because an idea that's thrown around a lot when we're teaching about the menstrual cycle is that ovulation connects us with the mother archetype. But when you link this to the matrilineal line, that comes into such a more stark relief, because it means that each one of your menstrual cycles is unique, because the menstrual cycle is captained by the eggs themselves. Like we said before, right? Think of the 15 to 20 follicles that are developing during the follicular phase. It's actually a coating on the follicle itself, and the follicle contains the egg. It's the coating around the follicle itself that begins to develop. That is the estrogen. That's where the estrogen of the entire follicular phase comes from. And it's the follicle stimulating hormone that it's a brain womb connection. The pituitary gland stimulates the follicle stimulating hormone, which tells the eggs to begin to develop and emit estrogen. And since each egg would result in a different baby depending on what month you get pregnant in, then it means that each one of your menstrual cycles is unique. And I had been applying this to the death of the egg and PMS, and trying to argue that we can't expect our cycles to always be the same one after the other, because the entire luteal phase is orchestrated by the casing of one dead egg. And so that one dead egg contains unique genetic codes that would yield a potential, that would result in a potential future individual. And so that's a good reasoning to understand why our luteal phases might each one be different from each other. But then this also means this is true for ovulation. And ovulation is the time of the cycle where women feel the most creative. We're at the pinnacle of our magnetism. We're attractive. We're like, if you do a presentation when you're ovulating, just everything rules perfectly. And how beautiful is it to start to see that time of your cycle as a gift from a potential future baby? And so that really is bringing you into the mother energy, because you're the mother of this baby who's like, it's not a baby, it's an egg, of course, but the baby is the egg is trusting you to be the vessel for its short-lived life upon the earth, which is just the amount of time that it's ovulated. All right, so let's dive right into it now. I'm going to give you the method the way I teach it. Although all of this is really just from Toni Weschler's book, Taking Charge of Your Fertility, and of course my own experience and my own spin on it with the death of the egg. And so really what I am realizing my role is in this sphere of fertility awareness is, like, we have to go beyond this, right? But let's really get a good, clear understanding of what we're going beyond before we begin to question it. So let's start with temperature. And we'll start with, what is fertility awareness method? So FAM is a self-awareness technique that allows you to identify your fertile window. Your fertile window is a combination of your ovulation window. So eggs can live, I have seen some, like, I've seen it out there, places that eggs can live 6 hours, but it's more commonly shown as 12 to 24 hours. So I've seen it as 6 to 24 or 12 to 24. I also want to give a disclaimer that while I go through this, all of the numbers I give, these are just numbers that I have taken from the collective. And I think we should really question whether these numbers apply for all women. And so I just want you to know, like, as I speak about these numbers, I don't fully believe in them. And I think that ovulation could last maybe longer than 24 hours. And that I don't think that we have studies on the woman's body that like can actually prove whether these numbers are like 100% true. Hang on one second. Grab something. All right. So, um, the eggs, they can live, let's say, 6 to 24 hours, but we can extend the ovulation window to 48 hours in the case of fraternal twins. So identical twins are another situation where the egg is separating after conception happens. So identical twins are just one egg, but fraternal twins are two eggs. So how can that happen? It happens from one egg being emitted before the first egg dies. Sorry, I'll say that again. The second egg is emitted before the first one dies. And the reason why the second egg has to come out before the first egg dies is because the core wisdom of fertility awareness is that the progesterone emitted from the casing of the dead egg, which is the corpus luteum, makes subsequent ovulations impossible. So that means if you've ovulated and your egg is dead, you can't ovulate again. So twins are happening when one egg is emerging before the first one dies. So that's how we can get a maximum of 48 hours for the ovulation window. And we talk about the fertile window lasting a maximum of 7 days. And the reason is that we add 5 days before those 2 days we just talked about during ovulation. We add 5 days because sperm can survive in fertile cervical fluid for up to 5 days. And so within that with those parameters, you could also have a shorter fertile window. The question you have to ask yourself is, when does my fertile cervical fluid begin? So the beginning of your fertile cervical fluid, which is a change from dry to wet, that announces that your fertile window has begun and you should stop having unprotected sex if you don't want to get pregnant. And of course, the opposite's true. If you want to get pregnant, then your fertile cervical fluid is a sign that you should try to time intercourse around the time of your fertile cervical fluid to maximize your chances of getting pregnant. So let's zero in on temperature now. So as I mentioned, the first part of your menstrual cycle is your period. So period is 1, follicular phase is 2, ovulation is 3. So those first 3 parts of your menstrual cycle, they're all cool. So that would be from day 1 of your menstrual cycle until, let's say, you ovulate. Maybe you ovulate on day 15, could be day 10, day 20. So somewhere in the middle of your cycle. So those first, let's call it 17 days, okay? So those first 17 days are all going to be cool. Here, let me show you this. So here you can see this is a chart from the menstrual journals that I make. And you can see here that on day 16, right? I ovulated on day 16 because you can see all of these first 16 temperatures are low. And yes, they do jump up and down a little bit, right? But the key is to compare a group of temperatures from these first 3 parts of the menstrual cycle. So period, follicular phase, and ovulation. And we need many temperatures because it would be hard to compare just 2 temperatures, or 2 over here and 2 over here. We need 10 or 16 or, at least 8 temperatures to be able to compare with the ones over here. So here's the dividing line. So the 4th part of the menstrual cycle is the luteal phase, and it's the luteal phase that is the warmer part of your cycle. So temping is when you take your temperature underneath your tongue in the morning when you wake up. And I know there's also the product Tempdrop, which is available, which seems great. And I don't want to use it because I'm not into apps for fertility awareness, or I don't want to wear something while I'm sleeping, but I do think it's cool how it seems to really accurately give women a very accurate temperature reading. But if you don't want to use Tempdrop, then you can take your temperature in the morning when you wake up, and the idea is to control the variables. It's like science class in grade 10, how if you're studying one aspect of something, then you don't want other factors that could also change your results. So by taking your temperature, you're trying to see how is my menstrual cycle affecting your temperature. You don't want other factors like how is going to the bathroom before I take my menstrual cycle, before I take my temperature affecting my temperature, or how is the water that I drank before I tempt affecting my temp. So that's the reason why you take it immediately upon waking. And you can just write it down in your diary or text it to your boyfriend or whatever, write it somewhere. And then enter it into your chart. And you'll be able to see a group of lower temperatures jumping to a group of higher temperatures right after you ovulate. So this jump here shows the death of the egg. This shows that the egg has died. So then cervical fluid, let's go back to cervical fluid. That's good. That's a good picture. So here are some pictures of what cervical fluid looks like under the microscope. It's so amazing and just beautiful. And the one that's there in C, that's also called ferning, which is just so cute that it looks like ferns. And the idea is that it makes kind of highways that the sperm can flow through easily. So it's like a conduit for sperm. And it's also alkaline, which matches. I'm so glad there's stuff going on in the chat. Drop any questions in the chat. I love to see that. So the sperm is also alkaline, so it's a good match for the sperm. And this is why fertile cervical fluid can sustain and nourish the sperm for 3 to 5 days until you ovulate. This is how my daughter Nula was conceived. My husband and I had sex on day 6 of my cycle. So it was right after I had my period. And then I ovulated on day 10. And there was fertile cervical fluid present on day 6 of my cycle. And so the sperm that ended up becoming my daughter survived within me for those 4 days until I ovulated on day 10. And um, yes. Okay, sorry. And so, but the important thing is to notice when you change from dry to wet. So in that story that I just spoke about, you can see that I was fertile immediately when my follicular phase began. My period was over on day 5. My follicular phase started on day 6. We had sex, and I was fertile on that day because I conceived on day 10. So let's talk about cervical fluid, and I'm going to illustrate 2 different scenarios. So let's start with the first scenario that would be more my scenario that I just outlined for you. So a woman gets her period, and then immediately after she's wet. So she doesn't have any infertile days after her period, right? And you also can conceive during your period if there's fertile cervical fluid present, and if you ovulate very soon, very early in your cycle. Like if you let's say you're on day 4 of your period, there's fertile cervical fluid mixed with the blood, and then you ovulate on day 7, 3 days later, you could get pregnant that way. So that's why I speak about the luteal phase being really blanket statement for all women. I can say this and stand by this. You will not get pregnant if you're in your luteal phase. The tricky part is that you might think you're in your luteal phase, but you're actually not. So that's how fertility awareness can help you so much. So that was the scenario of the first woman. She's going directly from her period to wet. But for another woman, she might finish her period and then have some dry days. And at the beginning of her follicular phase, if she has dry days, she can consider herself not fertile and she could have unprotected sex and not conceive. This is not my recommendation. I'm going to get into this at the end, but I recommend pulling out definitely at the beginning of your cycle. Like pull out, like maybe you don't need to pull out during your period, but you should pull out, not you should, but like what I do is pull out immediately after your period and just continue that on until you know you're in your luteal phase and you know the egg has died and you know you're in PMS. And then that's a good time to start having semen again within your vagina. So for both these women, sorry, I'm going to finish with the second woman. So she gets her period, she's dry for a few days. Then she notices a point of change where the fluid is changing from dry to wet. And so this will be her red light to let her know to stop having unprotected sex because her fertile window has begun. So you can see how these two signs are dovetailing together to allow us to see the fertile window. Your cervical fluid lets you know when your fertile window has started, and your temperature lets you know when your fertile window has ended. Because the onset of fertile cervical mucus announces that ovulation is imminent, it's going to happen soon. But your temperature shift tells you that the ovulation happened and the egg is dead. So that's why we use these two factors together to identify the fertile window. And what's important with cervical mucus isn't when you have your wettest day, but when you have your last wet day. So your last wet day is called the peak day. So it might not be your most wet day. You might have had egg white fluid earlier, but then you continued to have some creamy, cloudy fluid after the egg white fluid. And when you change from wet to dry, that's when you know you have ovulated and the egg is dead. Because under the influence of progesterone, which is emitted by the corpus luteum, the casing of the dead egg, your cervical fluid dries up. And actually, when you're in your luteal phase, this is also true if you have dry days at the beginning of your cycle, like any dry days, your cervical fluid is actually creating a barrier within your cervix, similar to a mucus plug, right? In pregnancy. And it's the dry tacky fluid is actually like sand. Well, it's not like sand, but it reminds me of sand in the cervix, preventing sperm from going up into the vagina. And this is also a thing. This is also an issue of is it basic or is it acidic? We said before that the fertile cervical fluid's alkalinity matches the alkalinity of the sperm, but in your when you have the dry cervical fluid, your vagina is acidic and it's extremely hostile to sperm. So sperm will die within, I forget the exact like amount, like minutes. I feel like it's minutes. The sperm will die within minutes in your vagina during your luteal phase when your fluid is dry. So we can really see how these two different types of cervical fluid are like black and white opposites. And they have very different function in the body. The fertile cervical fluid is a conduit drawing the sperm up into the body, nourishing the sperm, sustaining the sperm, and the dry cervical fluid is a barrier that is killing the sperm. So this is another reason why you should feel really great about having unprotected sex during your luteal phase. All right, okay, I think that's good for cervical fluid. And this is the egg white fluid if if you've never seen it or you don't know about it. And actually, let me outline, there's three types of cervical fluid. There's dry cervical fluid, non-peak fluid, and peak fluid. So this one that is shown here, the egg white fluid, that's the peak cervical fluid. But actually, I'm realizing this vocabulary is kind of confusing because, like, you don't need to have egg white fluid on your peak day, right? We just talked about that. That's your last wet day, not necessarily your wettest day. So some women can ovulate without ever seeing egg white fluid. It's more important to change from dry to wet. Underneath the umbrella of wet, we have non-peak and peak. So non-peak fluid is opaque. That's the big dividing line between the non-peak fluid and the peak fluid. Non-peak is opaque. It's not see-through. So the adjectives we can use are cloudy, creamy, milky, but the egg white fluid is clear. And yes, it might be able to sustain sperm for longer, but in the fertility awareness world, we talk about both peak and non-peak cervical fluid being fertile. So you have to consider if you see whether or not it's stretchy and clear, like even if it's just cloudy and creamy, you still have to consider yourself fertile and that sperm could live in that like wet fluid, like any wet fluid for 3 to 5 days. So let's go back to those scenarios we were illustrating of the two women. You get your period, you have a few dry days, you can shift into non-peak fluid first, where you have the cloudy milky fluid, and then you can have another point of change from the non-peak fluid to the peak fluid, where it's the see-through stretchy fluid. And that could be the flow, right? Or you could just have your period, dry days, and maybe just non-peak going right into ovulation, or it could be your period, follicular phase. Maybe you're going right to peak and then ovulation. So the most important thing is just to write it down and check your cervical fluid throughout the day. And then after the day is done, you report on the most wet fluid you saw during that day. So if you were dry all day, but then you saw a little bit of egg white fluid, you can't write dry. You need to write egg white fluid. Okay, so this is another aspect of fertility awareness is the height of your cervix. So when you're bleeding, your cervix descends. I think many of us can recognize that feeling as an embodied sensation. As the blood flows down, it does feel like your uterus descends. And so when the uterus descends, the vagina is shorter. So some women are able to put their fingers in their vaginas and feel the cervix and feel the height of it. I find it easier to pay attention to this through sex because sexual positions feel really different to me depending on where I am with my cervix. So after you bleed, then you're entering your follicular phase. And at that point, the cervix rises up. So your vagina will lengthen and the cervix also opens and becomes soft when you have the fertile cervical fluid. And then when you ovulate, obviously the cervix is also open and soft and the vagina is long, the cervix is heightened. But then this is another physiological sign of the egg dying. As soon as the egg dies, the cervix will descend for the luteal phase. So during the luteal phase, the cervix has descended and the opening of the cervix is hard and closed. All right, let's go into the menstrual wheel of the year. So when I was laying out the diary, well, first it was really the death of the egg, right? That I discovered. I discovered that the death of the egg is happening right here between ovulation and the luteal phase. And then I started to see what's the bridge between summer and fall, right? Because within the fertility awareness world, we have this beautiful analogy that the 4 main parts of the menstrual cycle each have a corresponding season. So since I had discovered the bridge between ovulation and the luteal phase, I also began to see it as the bridge between summer and fall, which is the fall equinox. So after I discovered that, then I started to wonder, if I have discovered the fall equinox, can I discover the winter solstice of our cycle? What's the spring equinox of our cycle? What's the summer solstice of our cycle? And I did see that there is a moment. And the cool thing about these solstices and equinoxes of the menstrual cycle is they're instantaneous. So when your blood will come, that's just a moment, right? Like when you switch from being in your luteal phase to being in your period, it's like a turning point, an axis. And also here when your blood stops, right? And here too, when finally the egg emerges from the ovary. So you'll have to come to Beyond Fam to hear my theories on how I don't think these are arbitrary. This is the big, I'll just give you the teaser right now for Beyond Fam is ovulation arbitrary? The story we're told, the story I've been telling you today is that the eggs are racing to be the biggest one. And then it's finally, once the egg becomes big enough, that's the egg that's ovulating. But do we really believe that as women? Is that really truly our experience? So within the world of fertility awareness, many educators talk about how ovulation can be delayed. Ovulation can be delayed by stress, sickness, So the big thing I want to share with you in Beyond Fam is, can ovulation be triggered? All right. So after I had figured that out, of the 8 parts of the menstrual cycle, that was the first year of the diary. 2023, I had this laid out. And in 2023, my wonderful artist, Amy, who drew all of this, I'm not an artist, I just do the design. She's the one who has just this wonderful artistic ability. So when the first year we did the diary, I asked Amy to draw, I wanted 28 moon phases. That was my original. I was like, can you do that, Amy? Like, that's kind of crazy. Can you draw 28 different moon phases? And as Amy began to draw the moon phases, she told me, I can't draw 28 different moon phases. That would be so hard, right? For her with her hand drawings to like incrementally increase this waxing crescent until it like developed into the last quarter, and then like to add like a little bit of black little by little to get like 10 moon phase, to get like 8 moon phases in between the last quarter and the waning gibbous. So what Amy and I decided to do was to draw, well, we decided that she would draw just these 8 moon phases. And after we had these 8 moon phases on paper, I saw the parallel between these 8 parts of the menstrual cycle and the 8 parts of the moon cycle. So I started to see how, I mean, this has definitely been established before me, the idea that the energy of the new moon echoes the energy of your period. And it doesn't mean that you'll necessarily get your period along with the new moon, but it more just means that the archetype of the new moon is that your period has the spirit of the archetype of the new moon, and the same with ovulation. Ovulation has the archetype of the full moon. But look, we can think of when your blood stops as the moon is beginning to develop, and then the follicular phase is like a stable place, first quarter, where we're just pausing there, and then again transitioning from the first quarter into the full moon is the waxing gibbous. And so I just thought that was so cool, and is just an extra layer that we as a collective can add into our understanding of the menstrual cycle. And I also started to see how there's an element for each part of the menstrual cycle. So I started to see how your period is like the earth, and follicular phase is the water, and ovulation is the fire, and the luteal phase is the air. And so then these transition moments become an alchemical shift. The transition moment between the luteal phase and your period, when your blood is about to come, that's an alchemical shift between the element of air moving into the element of earth. And don't we feel that, right? Like in the luteal phase, we're just like being blown around by emotions. And then suddenly the air is alchemized into earth, and we can land in your period. And so that's another part of fertility awareness and the menstrual cycle, is recognizing when you're in any given state of the menstrual cycle. So I like to think of it as a state change, just the same way that water can appear in the form of ice or gas or liquid. The phases of our menstrual cycle are the same. It's the same woman, but we're shifting into a different state. And so sometimes we can get the signals that we have shifted into a different state, but have we really? Have we really stabilized? For example, like you might think you've ovulated, but have you really stabilized into the luteal phase? So these tools that we looked at, temperature and cervical fluid, they can help you so much to become aware of what part of the menstrual cycle you're in. And what I really want to go into in Beyond Fam with what that analogy I just gave with the state change, again, like, is it arbitrary? Like the movement from the luteal phase into your period, like if we can imagine, like, let's say the luteal phase is the ice, right? And your period is like the liquid. So we're melting the ice as we go into your period, but like what melts the ice? Is it just arbitrary, or are there forces that are the impetus for these huge turning points in the menstrual cycle? All right. So now, let me tell you my 5-part approach to avoiding pregnancy, and I am going to keep the 5th part back because it just fits better in the next part. So I'll take you through the first 4 parts, but just know that there's a part missing from this. So if you're charting and you're charting your temperature and you're charting your cervical fluid, basically I'm trying to ask the question, should you take those signs as higher than, or do they have more authority than your intuition? And my answer to that is absolutely not, no. So what we're trying to do when we're avoiding pregnancy is to always be going towards the side of caution to make sure that we're outside of our fertile window. So let's imagine a scenario where your fertile cervical fluid has stopped. You've had that point of change from wet to dry. And you've also seen the temperature shift. So you've seen 3 hot temperatures and you think you're in your luteal phase. Those signs from fertility awareness are telling you you're in your luteal phase. But what if you just intuitively don't feel like your egg has died yet? What if you just still feel amazing and in your ovulation energy? My recommendation is to wait until your intuition lines up with the signs that you're seeing in your chart. Because why not just bring yourself to more caution? Why not just wait until those 3 signs, cervical fluid, temperature, and intuition, have all lined up? And then to add in another aspect would be the moon phase. So if you notice that your cycles are going along with the rhythm of the moon. So maybe you've been charting for a few months and you see that every full moon you're ovulating and every new moon you're getting your period. So then you arrive in this new cycle and you got your period with the new moon, 10 days ago. You're before the full moon. The full moon hasn't happened yet. And your chart is telling you that you're already in your luteal phase. But maybe it just doesn't feel right to you because you want to pass through that full moon that you're usually ovulating under. So I would say, like, absolutely wait until that full moon passes. So what I'm saying is that you want all 3 of these signs to line up before you give yourself the green light. You want to see the proof on your chart that you're outside of your fertile phase. You want the moon that you expected to ovulate under to have passed. And you want to feel in your body like you're in PMS, you're in your luteal phase, and your egg has died. Now, the most groundbreaking part of this approach is the man, and how in the fertility awareness world, women have been taking way too much responsibility for avoiding conception. And the man can take such a huge weight off of our shoulders by pulling out. So I'm a child of the 80s. I was in high school in the early 2000s, and sex education at that time really painted pull-out method as if it was useless. Like, you might as well have had him ejaculate in you if he pulled out. Like, that doesn't do anything to help, right? Like, there was so much fear around pulling out because they wanted us as young teenagers to use condoms. But the truth about pulling out is that it reduces your chances of getting pregnant drastically. So when a man ejaculates inside a woman's vagina, he releases 200 to 500 million sperm in one ejaculation. And so in the case of my daughter, who was conceived before I in the case of my daughter who was conceived before I ovulated, my husband ejaculated, let's say 500,000 sperm into me on day 6, right? So on day 6, there were 500,000 sperm inside me. And then on day 7, maybe 100,000 of those sperm had died. So now we're talking about 400,000 sperm. And then on day 8, maybe another 100,000 had died. So we're down to 300,000. And then on day 9, we're down to 100,000 maybe. And on day 10, maybe we're down to like less than hundreds of millions. Sorry, I feel like I said thousands instead of millions. They're big numbers. You get what I'm saying? Like, every day the sperm count is getting lower and lower of this like reservoir of sperm that are living in you. And that's how conception can happen, because some sperm are still alive all those days later. But if my husband had pulled out on day 6 of that cycle, there's no way my daughter Nula would have been conceived, because with pulling out, there is a possibility that there's 0 sperm. And this would be the case if there's no precum, which is possible, or if the precum just doesn't contain sperm, which is also possible. So the way that sperm gets into the precum is if the man recently ejaculated. So if he ejaculated, maybe like 2 or 3 hours before you guys have sex, and he didn't pee in between, because peeing like clears the urethra of the sperm. So I think we need to shift some of the responsibility of fertility awareness onto the man. In the same way that as women, if we don't want to get pregnant, we're charting our cycles, we're aware of when our fertile window is. He also needs to be aware of when his virile window is, and his virile window is when he ejaculates. And so his responsibility is to be aware of that moment when he shifts from being not fertile, or like not virile, or not like seminal, or not able to have a baby, when he shifts from not being able to have a baby to the possibility of having a baby. And that moment is the ejaculation. And so if the men in our lives begin to take care of ourselves, if the men in our lives begin to take care of us by saying, I'm just going to pull out always. Maybe that works for you guys. Maybe you don't want to pull out in the luteal phase, which, yeah, okay, you can not pull out in the luteal phase. That would be like my recommendation of the only time to have ejaculate within you is actually during the luteal phase. I know that's a conservative approach, but I feel confident in saying that to women because I feel like it can really work. And during all the other times of the cycle, my recommendation is to pull out. Of course, if you really don't want to conceive, then during your fertile window, you should use a condom or abstain. But why not just pull out like at the beginning of the cycle, as we spoke about, after your period, even if you have dry days, like why not just pull out on day like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, before you notice that point of change, before your fertile fluid becomes wet? Why not just pull out? It has an added advantage also, which is that it allows you to be more in tune with your own fluid patterns, because semen looks exactly like egg white fluid. And so if you have semen mixed in with your own juices, you might think that you have egg white fluid, but it's actually your man's semen. And you'll have to come to Beyond Fam to hear the 5th one. And it's related into this whole pulling out sperm thing, just to give you another teaser there. All right. I feel like I'm going to pull this together here for the last part. So we will save some time for questions. This should take me about 10 minutes. So we should have a good 20 minutes for questions at the end. So let's talk about charting during postpartum. And this teaching will also really apply to any women who have irregular cycles or long cycles, or if you're wondering if you're ovulating. So charting during postpartum is tricky but doable. And I'm just going to flip back here to this. So the trick with postpartum is that let's like redo this for giving birth. Okay, so your period will be when you gave birth, and then your blood stops flowing. That's like when your blood stops after you gave birth. And then you're going to enter into a prolonged follicular phase, which is symbolized by the spring. And when I first shared this online with the statement, postpartum is a prolonged inner spring, some women reacted saying like, postpartum really doesn't feel like springtime to me, like energetic, which I totally get. It's such a like, it's like the wintry hinterlands of womanhood. Postpartum is so intense. And like, of course it doesn't feel like sunshine and flowers and like gentle rain. But what I would say to that is maybe we could think about spring, like the early spring, when you're still like in the muck and the mud and there's like still snow and it's not cold, or sorry, it's not warm, it's still cold, right? So maybe the postpartum feels more like that when we're talking about spring. So when you're nursing your baby, like if you're nursing and you're nursing your baby on demand, the hormone that is produced when you're nursing is called prolactin, and prolactin suppresses estrogen production. So even right after you give birth, your body is going to try to ovulate. The in your brain, your hypothalamus and pituitary gland are going to send out the follicle stimulating hormone, which encourages the follicles to begin to develop. And but at the same time, there's like a feedback loop happening because you're nursing your baby, and so the prolactin is going to suppress all of that estrogen production. So at the same time as the body is trying to ovulate, the nursing is suppressing the buildup of estrogen. And so you're you I mean, some women get their periods back 2 months postpartum, right? So it's variable. But I'm talking about women where it takes maybe a few months to get their periods back, or up to a year after giving birth. So you're so all through that time you're like trying to ovulate, but it's being suppressed. And so basically you're trying to reach the threshold of estrogen necessary to get that egg to be propelled out of the follicle, but you're never reaching it. And so what will that look like in your fluid patterns? It's periods of dry days interspersed with periods of wet days. Because as your body builds up to trying to release the egg, if it feels like it fails, and like, so it'll be trying to build up, you'll get a little bit of fluid, and then the body will realize, like, oh, I didn't reach the threshold necessary. I'm just going to give up. So it will revert back into the dry days, but then it will try again. And when I was postpartum with my children, I took my temperature every morning, and it really helped because I was able to see just this huge group of cool temperatures for the first 8 months after giving birth. Like I got my period back 8 months postpartum with both of my children. And so all through those 8 months, I just saw cool temperatures. And yes, I was having wet days and dry days, but I knew I hadn't ovulated because I didn't have the confirmation in my chart from my temperature showing that I had ovulated. So I what I would do is I would pull out if I was dry, or like have my husband pull out if I was dry. But then if I began to see cervical fluid, I would consider myself fertile and we would stop. We would abstain. In my journey with fertility awareness, my husband and I actually spent many years actually abstaining during the fertile window, which was a huge test of our willpower, but also very effective. And so that's what I was doing at that time. Of course, you could use a condom too. And like, of course, you could pull out, but the risk would be higher, right? Because as soon as you're wet, you have to consider that the beginning of your fertile window. So when we talk about the the number of days of the fertile window being 7 days, postpartum is an example of your fertile window is going to be way longer than 7 days, because it's when you add up all of the fertile windows together in one cycle, right? Like let's say you're wet for 5 days, back to dry for 10 days, wet for another 5 days. We need to add those 2 5 days together as the total fertile days within one cycle. And this can happen to you even if you're not postpartum. You could build up towards ovulating. You could think you're about to ovulate. If you don't see a temperature shift and you go back to dry, you can consider yourself outside of your fertile window. But then if you resume back into wet cervical fluid, you have restarted your fertile window. So what are we looking for in postpartum? We're looking for this moment, this axis, when the summer solstice happens and the egg comes through the ovary. So we're looking, when do you switch from spring into summer? And how we can know that is through the temperature. So yes, with cervical fluid, like in a normal situation, you're looking for when the cervical fluid becomes dry. You're going wet, 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 and then you're looking for when it goes dry. Some people use fertility awareness method without temping. And the way they do that is just by looking at cervical fluid. When you have that point of change and you become dry, now the key is that you become dry and you stay dry, right? That can let you know that you're in your luteal phase. But that's tricky during postpartum because you might not stay dry. And so that's why the temping helps so much, to give yourself a clue that you will stay dry, because it's possible to conceive before you've even had a period, right? Like we've probably heard stories of this from women that they had a baby, they gave birth, and they got pregnant without even having a period. And so how that can happen is if you get pregnant during this summer solstice time, but you didn't realize that it was the summer solstice. You didn't realize you were ovulating. So you're going to go straight from like birth, postpartum, this prolonged follicular phase of postpartum straight into pregnancy. This can happen. And I just want to say about postpartum that I just feel for you if you're in postpartum, like how overwhelming it might be. The idea of getting pregnant again after you've just given birth for me was so tender, because your body is in a state of, you know, like, it's in a tender state after you give birth. And so the idea of getting pregnant again right after you give birth is so overwhelming. And I think this information about charting during postpartum should, what I hope is that it actually makes you feel more calm and relaxed during probably the time in a woman's life that is the most, um, you're the most on the edge of your seat when it comes to charting. Like it's kind of like the most, like the stakes feel so high during postpartum. All right, let's see. I think, oh, good. Let's go back. Hang on. Oh, that's not the right thing. Oh, here we go. Yeah, and so that's just the same for long, short, and irregular cycles. Like you could be having a short cycle. Like if you're having cycles that aren't totally regular, it might be because you're not ovulating. And so using fertility awareness can help you by confirming ovulation. If you have a shift in temperature, that's a sign that you are ovulating. And so that can be helpful. Like you can have a long, a short, or an irregular cycle and still be ovulating. So it's not necessarily true that having these atypical cycles means you're not ovulating. But what I just outlined with the postpartum charting is really applicable to if you have a long cycle. You're also looking for the moment when you're shifting from a prolonged inner spring, from a prolonged follicular phase into your summer solstice, into your ovulation time. And what was I just gonna say? Um, I can't remember now. Hopefully we'll come back. All right. Well, I'll see if it comes back. But I just want to say that if you liked how that chart looked that I was showing you before, you can get your own inside a Feral Flow diary. I would love for you to buy a diary. And if you loved your diary, it would mean so much to me if you wrote a review. You don't even have to write one, even just clicking the 5 stars would be adding your magnetism to my project. So I would appreciate that so much. And if you have any girls in your life who would benefit from having this method that I said, but without any emphasis on sex or relationships or getting pregnant, this is the resource for you. It also gives all of my teachings in a much simpler way that is, I really wrote it for, young girls from, let's say, 8 until 16. And if it's a young girl who is having sex, I would just say, not a young girl who's having sex, but you know what I mean? Like if it's a teenager, I would just say get her the woman's diary. Or if she needs to know about the conception and those kinds of things, avoiding pregnancy. And I would love if you came to Beyond Fam on February 24th. And yes, I would love to hear your questions. I'm going to stop this share now, and you can just unmute yourself and call them out. And I'll read out a few here. Yeah, here, this is a good one. What would your temps do if you have an anovulatory cycle? That's such a great question. Holly, are you still here? Okay, you are still here. Yeah, that's such a great question. So if you have an anovulatory cycle, basically you're having just your period, follicular phase, period. You're kind of like going between those 2 parts of the menstrual cycle. And It's not a true period, it's a withdrawal bleed. So when we talk about like last menstrual period, the distinction between a menstrual period and a withdrawal period is that a menstrual period is the result of having ovulated. So it's the kind of period that comes from like you've ovulated, the egg is dead, the casing of the endometrium has been building up more under the influence of progesterone, and then the lining is shed. But when you have an anovulatory cycle, you can still bleed because even during the follicular phase, your endometrium is building up. It builds up more during the luteal phase after your egg has died, but during the follicular phase, the endometrium is still building. So if you're having an anovulatory cycle, you're in a long follicular phase. So the endometrium is building, building, building. Like let's say your cycle is like 45 days long. So for 45 days, you've been building the endometrium bit by bit, and your body has also been trying to ovulate. Exact same scenario as the postpartum. You're just trying to reach that threshold of estrogen necessary that's going to trigger the luteinizing hormone, which is the hormone that ultimately propels the egg out of the follicle. And so you've just never reached the threshold of estrogen necessary for the luteinizing hormone to kick in. And so at a certain point, your body realizes like it's not going to happen this time, basically. And the body, so it's for two reasons. One is like the body's ready to reset, but the other is that the endometrium has just become so heavy, it cannot sustain itself anymore. And so at that point, bleeding is triggered, and the estrogen, follicle stimulating hormone, and any level of LH that was happening, all three of those hormones plummet, and your bleeding is triggered. But you're not going to notice any change in temperature because you're just going to be cool all that time. Like you're cool during your period, you're cool during the follicular phase, and then you're going back to a withdrawal bleeding. So it's just going to be like a flat line. Cool. Okay, thank you so much for asking this question because I forgot to say something. So can I say this and then I'll go back to the questions, which is that there's a symmetry in the temperature shifts. So if we're talking about like not an anovulatory cycle, just a regular cycle, we're having a temperature shift, as we said, after the egg dies, right? After the egg dies, we're shifting from cool to warm. So the way I outlined the temperature was like we have three parts that are cool and one part that's warm. We have period, follicular, ovulatory are cool, and then luteal is warm. But let's think about that configuration in another way by looking at when are the shifts, right? Like if luteal is warm and what follows right after luteal is period, which is cool, then that's another shift. There's a second shift. And women use this shift from warm to cool, from warm during the luteal phase to cool during your period. That's like a warning signal that your period's going to come soon. If you're temping, you'll see that drop at the end of your luteal phase that will let you know your period's coming soon. So one thing I think is so cool is how both of these shifts in the temperature, the impetus for both of these shifts is a death energy. Because what's happening at the end of your luteal phase, it's that your corpus luteum, its lifespan has run out. So the casing of the dead egg that has been emitting progesterone and sustaining your endometrium, it has a finite lifespan because it's not fertilized. If it was fertilized, it would live on and sustain the baby. But since the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum eventually dies. And so it's the death of the corpus luteum that causes the plummet in hormones, causes the blood to shed. And so isn't that a cool parallel between it's the death of the egg that causes the temperature to rise between ovulation and luteal, and it's the death of the corpus luteum that causes the temperature to drop between luteal and period. Let me say that again. It's the death of the corpus luteum that causes the shift from luteal to period. It causes the shift from warm to cool. And so when we think about the death energy in the menstrual cycle and like how creative it can be, this is a good symbol of how the death energy is really creating the shifts of the menstrual cycle. The death energy is like the engine of the menstrual cycle, driving it forward, pushing you into the next phase. Okay, Holly, did that answer your question about anovulatory cycles? And did you have any follow-up questions about anovulatory cycles?
Yeah, thank you for answering that. I guess I would just want to ask, when you do have that bleeding that's not technically a menstrual blood, would you start your cycle at day 1 again?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question. Yeah, I would definitely start that on day 1 again. Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
thank you.
Yeah, and you can only really know for sure if it's anovulatory by temping, right? You might be ovulating.
Yeah, I just started temping a few weeks ago because I had like a 41-day cycle last time, and I'm like, I don't even know if I ovulated, but I'm 6 months postpartum, so I've only had a few cycles, so it's still just, I don't know what's happening.
Absolutely. And are you still breastfeeding?
No, my baby was stillborn, so I didn't breastfeed at all. Yeah.
Oh, Holly, I'm holding you in that. Yeah, so definitely that makes sense that your cycles would be like searching to regulate, right? And searching to like to settle in into a stable place. And I've also been having really long cycles. It's a trip for sure.
Yeah.
Uh, how many cycles have you had?
I think 4. I think I've had 4 bleeds. Yeah. Yeah. I'm on the 4th cycle.
That's a beautiful journey you and your baby walked, even though tragic, right? I love the idea that your baby chose you for that, for that like space of time that your baby was on the earth. You were her or his home, and that's just so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely been a beautiful journey. Tragic, but beautiful. Yeah. Thank
Well,
you.
yeah, thanks for sharing that. All of us here are holding that for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Hi, I'm Taylor's cousin. Would love to chat. Pick your. Okay, maybe I'll. Thank you so much, Taylor's cousin. What's your name? Rochelle? Are you Rochelle? Hi, Rochelle. Thanks so much for being here. Okay, Holly, oh, your diary's coming. Okay, amazing. Okay, I think that was all the questions. So, does anyone have any other questions that you want to just call out? Yeah, here we go. There's one more coming in the chat. Okay, I'll read it out. Question about relying on cervical fluid. How often, when do we need to check cervical fluid if using for a FAM? It's kind of confusing to me because it doesn't seem like my cervical fluid is the same throughout the day, more like changing moment to moment. Absolutely. So the key is that you have to record the most fertile fluid that you saw within the day. So you could write it down like all day, and then if you have, or like kind of do it in your head, whatever, because that would be a lot to like write it down all day. Who asked this question? Let me see. Cass. Oh, you're there, Cass. Nice. So you want to you do check it throughout the day, like check it every time you go pee basically, or like anytime, like you can definitely check it multiple times a day. And then that is confusing if you have like various levels of fertile fluid throughout the day, right? One important thing is to not confuse um fluid with arousal fluid, like not confuse cervical fluid with arousal. So, like, obviously, it's not the fluid that's happening when you're having sex. It's just like your general fluid that's coming like during the day. And yeah. So, does that answer your question? You write down the most fertile that you see. So, like, let's give an example. Let's say you checked 4 times during the day. You had like cloudy, milky, egg white, cloudy. I would write down egg white because that's like the most fertile out of those 4 types. There is a hierarchy between the non-peak and the peak fluid, and it's not about which one can sperm live in for longer. It's about which one announces that your ovulation is imminent. And the egg white fluid is a really good indicator of the ovulation being imminent. And also Mittelschmerz. I don't know if some of you saw my post on Mittelschmerz. I forgot to talk about Mittelschmerz. Mittelschmerz, that's like the sensation that you feel when you ovulate. So this whole idea that we can only confirm ovulation after we ovulate, like it's that kind of does a disservice to women because some of us can feel it intuitively with middle schmers, with the egg white fluid. Like, of course, you need to wait and see if your egg white fluid is going to continue, right? Like, let's say you have egg white fluid on Thursday, you think you're going to ovulate the next day. But if you have egg white fluid on Friday, on Saturday, and Sunday, then you didn't ovulate on Friday, right? Does that make sense? Did that answer your question, Cass? Did you have a follow-up question? Okay, good. Awesome. All right. Well, were there any other questions? I'm trying to think if I forgot anything, but I feel like that was that was pretty. I think I did it. It's hard to not forget things. All right. Well, thank you all for coming again, and I really hope to see you in Beyond Fam and have the best day, okay? Bye. Bye.